The grand ballroom of Stanhope Park glittered, a galaxy of chandeliers pouring light onto a constellation of London's finest. It was the night of the annual agricultural ball, a tradition upheld by the Dukes of Stanhope for a century, and the current Duke, Julian, stood near the musicians, his posture immaculate, his smile a carefully calibrated instrument of aristocratic grace. His younger brother, Lord Alistair, held court by the champagne fountain, his laughter loud and frequent, the very picture of a man at ease with his good fortune. Then a stillness began at the great arched doorway, a silence that spread like frost across the parquet floor. The music faltered, heads turned, glasses halfway to lips were frozen in mid-air. There, framed by the doorway, stood Lucy, the Duchess of Stanhope. She was not wearing the gown of celestial blue silk the Duke had commissioned for her from Paris. Instead, she was dressed in a gown of dark gray wool, severe in its cut, the sort of garment a steward's wife might wear for a Sunday service. Her hair was not dressed with diamonds, but pulled back in a simple, unadorned braid. She wore no jewels. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, and as she began to walk forward, the crowd parted for her as if compelled by an invisible force. She did not look at her husband, whose smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury and disbelief. She walked past him without a glance, her pace unhurried, her focus absolute. She stopped before Lord Alistair. His charming smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He made to offer a witty remark, but the words died on his lips. For Lucy held not a fan or a dance card, but a plain, leather-bound ledger, its corners worn from use. The Duke took a sharp step forward, his voice a low command. "Lucy, what is the meaning of this spectacle?" She did not turn. Her gaze remained fixed on his brother. With a quiet, deliberate movement, she opened the book. But to understand the weight of that simple ledger and the profound silence it commanded, we must return to a damp autumn afternoon 3 years prior, to the day a marriage of convenience was meant to begin. For more stories of quiet strength and public vindication, subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. The Duke of Stanhope, Julian, had prepared for a wife, but he had not prepared for Lucy Graves. He had ordered the east wing of the great house aired and its Holland covers removed from the furniture, a concession to a bride who would, he assumed, occupy it as a stranger. He had instructed his housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, that the household should operate as it always had. There was to be no disruption. He was 34, owner of a title that stretched back to the Tudors and debts that were nearly as old. The marriage was a sensible arrangement, a union of his rank and her considerable, if untitled, fortune. He expected a quiet, plain woman who would understand her role, to provide an heir, manage the social calendar with placid obedience, and otherwise remain a decorative and unobtrusive fixture in his life. He anticipated a relationship of cool, respectful distance. What he received, on a Tuesday afternoon with the rain misting over the parkland, was something else entirely. The carriage that arrived was not a grand city affair, but a sturdy traveling coach, and from it emerged a woman of 28, whose steady brown eyes took in the magnificent stone facade of Stanhope Park, with appraisal rather than awe. Her first act upon crossing the threshold was not to ask for her rooms, but to present a still warm bundle wrapped in linen to the waiting housekeeper. "For the kitchen staff, Mrs. Gable," Lucy said, her voice clear and low. "The coaching inn at Stokechurch has the finest warm rolls. I thought they might appreciate them after a long day." Before she had even been shown to the drawing room, She had learned the names of the footman, Thomas, and the parlour-maid, Eliza, and had complimented the Polish on the grand oak staircase. Julian, waiting stiffly by the marble fireplace, found himself unaccountably wrong-footed. He had prepared a formal, rehearsed speech of welcome. It felt absurd in the face of this calm, practical woman. In her first week, the disruption he had forbidden arrived, but not in the form he expected. It was a quiet revolution of competence. She discovered, through a series of polite but persistent questions, that the linen stores were a chaotic mess, and spent 2 days with the maids, reorganizing them by size and use, her own hands folding sheets alongside theirs. She made the cook, Mrs. Finch, a woman whose disposition was as sour as her prized gooseberries, laugh aloud with a story about a failed attempt at baking a pigeon pie in her youth. And on Friday, while reviewing the household accounts she had requested, her brow furrowed. "Your Grace," she said to Julian that evening in the vast, chilly dining room, "I noticed the rents from the 3 northern tenants, Miller, Croft, and Swain, are marked as 2 months in arrears. Is that correct?" Julian waved a dismissive hand. "My brother Alistair handles the estate accounts. He assures me it is all in hand. Some tenants are perpetually slow to pay." Lucy said nothing more, but the look on her face was one of thoughtful consideration, not acceptance. In those early months, Julian found his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. He had envisioned a wife who would fill her days with needlepoint and novels. He found Lucy in the library late at night, poring over books on crop rotation and soil management. He had expected to dine alone or in silence. He found himself engaged in conversations about the estate's leaking roofs and the need for a new schoolmistress in the village. He began to seek her out. One evening, finding the dining hall empty, a footman directed him to Lucy's small sitting room, where she was eating a simple supper of soup and bread by the fire, a ledger open on the table beside her. He found himself sitting with her, sharing the simple meal, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily. There was more laughter from the servants' hall. The scent of beeswax and baking seemed stronger, and the gardens, long neglected, began to show signs of thoughtful care. A year into their marriage, their son Arthur was born. Julian, holding the small, swaddled infant, looked at his wife, her face tired but serene, and felt a profound, unnerving surge of affection. The sensible arrangement had become something dangerously close to happiness. He had ordered a wife in name only, and instead, a duchess had arrived, and quietly, competently, begun to transform his house into a home. The golden period, that quiet era of burgeoning warmth, lasted nearly 2 years. It was a time marked by small, domestic textures of contentment. The scent of lavender from the newly organized linen presses, the taste of Mrs. Finch's lemon cakes, which she now baked twice a week specifically for the Duchess. The sound of Arthur's laughter echoing in the long gallery. Julian found himself relying on Lucy's judgment, not just in household matters, but in the larger concerns of the estate. He would bring her ledgers in the evening, and they would sit together by the fire, her sharp mind untangling knots in the accounts that his land agent had declared hopeless. She had a gentle but firm way with the tenants, listening to their grievances about drainage or fencing, and proposing practical solutions that benefited both them and the estate. She was respected. For the first time in his life, Julian felt the weight of his title not as a burden, but as a shared stewardship. The old, cold shell of the Duke of Stanhope was cracking, revealing a man capable of warmth and admiration for his remarkable wife. Then, Lord Alistair returned from the continent. Alistair was Julian's younger brother, a man whose charm was as polished as his riding boots, and whose character had about the same depth. He had been living lavishly in Paris and Rome on a generous allowance from the estate, and he returned to Stanhope Park like a conquering hero, bearing gifts and tales of his continental adventures. At first, he was effusive in his praise of Lucy. "My dear sister, you are a miracle worker," he declared at his welcome dinner. "The old place has never looked better. And Julian, I've never seen him so domesticated." The word hung in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible barb. The erosion began there, with a single word. It was a campaign waged not with cannon, but with whispers, jokes, and the subtle poison of condescension. A week after his return, at a dinner party for their neighbors, Alistair made his first overt move. Lucy was explaining a successful new system she had implemented for the estate's dairy, which had increased their profits from butter and cheese. Alistair laughed, a warm, inclusive sound that drew the whole table in. "Listen to her," he said, gesturing with his wine-glass. "Our dear Duchess, with her parsonage bookkeeping, so very diligent. It's quite charming, is it not?" The guests smiled politely. Julian, who a month before would have praised Lucy's ingenuity, felt a prickle of unease, a sudden awareness of how her practicalities might appear to his sophisticated brother. He found himself smiling along, a faint, tight smile. "Lucy has a good head for figures," he said, the words sounding defensive and slightly foolish in the wake of Alistair's smooth dismissal. Lucy's own smile did not falter, but she set down her fork and said nothing more on the subject for the rest of the evening. The next exclusion was more direct. Julian was in his study with the land agent, Mr. Finch, discussing plans to drain the water meadows to the north. Lucy, having walked those very meadows only the day before, knocked and entered. "Julian, forgive me for interrupting," she began, "but if you place the main ditch along the old hedgerow, you will find the gradient is much more favorable." Before Julian could respond, Alistair, who had been lounging in a leather armchair, stood up and placed a light hand on her arm. "My dear Duchess, do not trouble your pretty head with ditches and tiles. The smell of damp earth is so unbecoming. Leave the men to their tedious business." He smiled, the soul of gallantry. This time, Julian capitulated completely. "Alistair is right, my dear. It is complex work. Why don't you see to the menus for next week's shooting party?" He turned back to the maps on his desk, and Lucy was left standing in the doorway, dismissed from the room where her counsel had once been sought. She simply inclined her head and withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. From that day on, the study door was often closed. She would walk past and hear the low murmur of her husband's and his brother's voices, discussing the estate business that was now, once again, solely theirs. The slow, grinding cruelty of being rendered invisible had begun. The chill that started in the study soon seeped into every corner of the house. Julian, once so appreciative of Lucy's competence, now seemed to view it through Alistair's mocking eyes as something unrefined and vaguely embarrassing. The campaign of diminishment escalated, moving from private dismissals to public humiliations, each one a small, sharp cut. At the autumn assembly in the local town, a visiting magistrate, Sir John Abernathy, a man known for his keen interest in agricultural reform, was introduced to their party. Lucy, who had read all of Sir John's published papers, was about to offer a comment on his work when Alistair smoothly stepped between them. "Sir John, you must allow me to present my brother, the Duke," he said, steering the man toward Julian. "He handles all such matters for the estate. The Duchess concerns herself with more domestic arts." Lucy was left standing beside a potted fern, her observation unspoken, her expertise erased. Julian, basking in the magistrate's attention, did not even notice the slight. His criticisms of her became more frequent, always couched in the language of concern, but carrying Alistair's venom. Her gowns, once praised for their elegant simplicity, were now deemed too plain. The quiet, intellectual guests she invited for dinner were uninspired. He began to insist she rest more often. "You look tired, my dear," he would say at the breakfast table. "Perhaps you should take a tray in your room this morning. Alistair and I have a great deal of business to get through." It was a polite, suffocating form of exile, confining her to the upper floors of the house while the life of the estate, the life she had revitalized, was conducted without her. The servants saw it all. Mrs. Gable would bring Lucy her tea with a look of silent sympathy in her eyes. Mrs. Finch would add an extra honey cake to her tray, a small, edible gesture of loyalty. They could not speak against the Duke or his brother, but their quiet kindnesses were a testament to the injustice they witnessed daily. The most painful moments, however, came through the innocence of their son. Arthur, now a bright, observant boy of 2, was sitting at the breakfast table one morning, watching his parents. Julian had made a curt remark about the household accounts being in a muddle, a clear, though indirect, criticism of Lucy. Arthur looked from his mother's still face to his father's frowning one. "Papa," he asked, his small voice piping into the tense silence, "why do you not smile at Mama anymore?" The question shattered the room's fragile peace. Julian flushed a deep, mottled red. "That's enough, Arthur. Eat your porridge." He threw his napkin onto the table and left the room without another word. Lucy's hand, which had been resting on her teacup, did not tremble. She calmly reached over and buttered a piece of toast for her son, her movements measured and deliberate. "Here you are, my love," she said, her voice perfectly even. It was in that moment, in her son's guileless observation, that she understood the full extent of her isolation. The final, definitive blow came a week later. She brought to Julian a discrepancy she had found, a double billing for seed corn amounting to a significant sum. It was precisely the kind of error she had been praised for catching in their first year together. Julian glanced at the paper she held out and pushed it back toward her. "A simple clerical error, Lucy," he said, his tone weary, as if her diligence were a burden to him. "Alistair has it all in hand now. He has hired a new clerk from London to modernize our methods. You need not concern yourself with the ledgers any longer." He was formally relieving her of the last vestiges of her authority, the very work that had defined her contribution to Stanhope Park. He was telling her, in the kindest, cruelest way possible, that she was no longer needed. She simply nodded, took the paper, and left his study, the closed door behind her a final confirmation of her exile. She was no longer a partner. She was merely the Duchess, confined to the gilded cage of her social duties, Lucy observed. Her mind, no longer occupied with drainage plans and rent rolls, was free to notice other things. She noticed the fine, almost translucent quality of the new porcelain at the dinner table, and the staggering bill that followed. She noticed Lord Alistair's new hunter, a magnificent beast that must have cost a fortune, and the delivery of 3 cases of exorbitant French brandy to his rooms. She saw the tailor from London, who arrived not for the Duke, but for his brother, and the expensive new wardrobe that resulted. And she noticed how Alistair's gambling debts, which were common gossip among the servants, seemed to miraculously resolve themselves. The estate, according to Julian, was merely holding its own, yet Alistair was living like a prince. The arithmetic did not add up. Her discovery of the truth came late one night, as discoveries of such truths often do. A headache had woken her, and she had made her way down the sleeping house's back staircase toward the kitchens, seeking a glass of cool milk. As she passed the corridor that led to the estate office, she saw a thin line of light under the door and heard the low murmur of voices. It was past 2 in the morning. She paused, her hand on the cool stone wall. The voices were Alistair's and Mr. Finch's, the land agent. She drew closer, her breath held. "The Duke believes every word," Alistair was saying, his voice laced with smug satisfaction. "He's convinced she's a meddling provincial with delusions of grandeur. He actually thanked me yesterday for lifting the burden of the accounts from her." There was a shuffling of papers. "As long as you continue to adjust the rent rolls as I instruct, her little discoveries will always look like foolish mistakes. She sees a double billing for seed. You produce a corrected invoice. It's perfect. She discredits herself." Mr. Finch's voice was nervous, reedy. "My lord, the shortfalls are becoming significant. The tenants, they talk. They know they've paid." "Let them talk," Alistair snapped. "They are farmers. I am the Duke's brother. Who do you imagine he will believe?" Lucy stood frozen in the dark corridor, a piece of ice forming in her stomach. The leak in the accounts she had found on her first week had not been a simple matter of arrears. It had been the beginning of this. Alistair was not just a spendthrift. He was a thief, systematically embezzling funds from the estate. He had not merely dismissed her competence. He had actively engineered her disgrace to provide cover for his crimes. And he had used her husband's vanity and insecurity as his primary tool. She backed away silently, her headache forgotten, her mind icily clear. She could not go to Julian. He was deaf to her, blinded by his brother's charm and his own pride. He would see her accusations as hysteria, as the bitter complaints of a woman scorned. He would demand proof, and her word against his brother's would be worth nothing. Therefore, she would have to find proof that was undeniable, proof that was written in ink and bound in leather. The next morning, she sent a note to the estate archivist. Citing an interest in the history of the Stanhope family, she requested the complete estate ledgers for the past 5 years be delivered to her private sitting room. In the quiet solitude of her rooms, while the great house hummed with a life from which she was now excluded, Lucy began her secret work. By the light of a single oil lamp, long after the household was asleep, she sat at her delicate rosewood desk, surrounded by heavy, dust-scented ledgers. The task was monumental. She began by comparing the official ledgers Alistair now controlled with the older archived books. Line by line, entry by entry, she traced the flow of money, the patterns of income and expenditure. Her practical, orderly mind, so long dismissed as a mere domestic skill, became a forensic weapon. She worked with meticulous patience, her quill scratching softly in the stillness of the night. Slowly, the full scope of the fraud revealed itself. It was a scheme of breathtaking audacity, hidden beneath layers of mundane bookkeeping. She found invoices for repairs to barns that had burned down a decade earlier. She found payments to a London architect for plans for a new wing that had never been commissioned. She found rents from tenants recorded as unpaid in Alistair's ledger, while the archived books showed those same tenants had been models of punctuality for years. She began to create her own book, a secret ledger bound in simple brown leather. In its pages, in her clear, precise hand, she documented every fraudulent transaction, cross-referencing dates, names, and amounts. She noted the purchase of Alistair's new hunter, and on the opposite page, a fictitious charge for replacing all the fences along the western pasture. She recorded the payment of his gambling debts, and beside it, an invented bill for restocking the ducal wine cellar. Her book was not just a record of theft, it was a map of betrayal. She was not entirely alone. She confided in Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman whose loyalty was to the house of Stanhope, not necessarily to its current master. Mrs. Gable's face, usually a mask of professional composure, tightened with grim fury as Lucy explained what she had found. From then on, the housekeeper became her silent co-conspirator. She stood watch, ensuring no one disturbed the Duchess during her late-night work. She brought her hot tea and biscuits and quietly procured old receipts from the kitchens, stables, and smithy, papers that helped Lucy corroborate the true costs of running the estate against Alistair's inflated figures. Through Mrs. Gable, Lucy also arranged a quiet meeting with Mr. Harris, a tenant farmer whose family had worked Stanhope land for generations. In the privacy of his cottage, Lucy explained her fears. The old farmer, who had always respected the straightforward Duchess, listened intently and then produced a small, locked metal box. It contained every rent receipt his family had received for 30 years. They perfectly contradicted the arrears recorded in Alistair's ledger. He gave them to her without hesitation. Meanwhile, Julian and Alistair remained cocooned in their oblivious arrogance. They saw Lucy's withdrawal and quietness not as a sign of purpose, but of defeat. "Poor Lucy," Julian said to his brother one evening over brandy. "She seems so withdrawn lately. I fear the duties of her position are too much for her." Alistair swirled his brandy, a smirk playing on his lips. "Perhaps, brother. Or perhaps she has finally accepted her proper place. The world of high finance is, after all, no place for a woman of her simple constitution." They laughed, never suspecting that in the room directly above them, that woman of simple constitution was building the case that would destroy them both. The perfect stage for the final act was, fittingly, Alistair's own creation. The annual Stanhope Agricultural Ball was to be the grandest in memory. Alistair had convinced Julian to spare no expense. There were to be musicians from London, champagne fountains, and a midnight supper of spectacular opulence. The highlight of the evening, Alistair had announced, would be the unveiling of the architect's drawings for a magnificent new folly to be built on the hill overlooking the lake, a grand testament to the Duke's wise and profitable management of the estate. It was the pinnacle of his arrogance, a monument to his own success, paid for with the very funds he had stolen. He intended it to be his triumph. Lucy intended it to be his judgment. On the evening of the ball, a new gown of celestial blue silk lay shimmering on Lucy's bed. A gift from Julian, a command for her to look the part of a proper, decorative duchess. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned to her wardrobe and took out the dress of dark gray wool. It was simple, severe, and utterly devoid of adornment. It was the dress of a woman who meant business. She braided her hair herself, pulling it back tightly from her face. She wore no jewels. Her transformation was an act of armoring. When she was ready, she went to the nursery. Arthur was asleep in his small bed, his face peaceful in the soft lamplight. She kissed his forehead, her touch feather-light. Then she returned to her room and took up a sealed envelope from her desk. She found Mrs. Gable waiting, as instructed, in the corridor. "Mrs. Gable," Lucy said, her voice steady. "If I am not back in my rooms by midnight, give this to Magistrate Abernathy. He is attending the ball tonight. Ensure it reaches his hand directly." The housekeeper's own hand was firm as she took the envelope. "Godspeed, Your Grace," she whispered. Downstairs, Julian was growing impatient. He saw her descending the grand staircase and his face clouded with anger. "For God's sake, Lucy, must you look like a governess? Tonight of all nights, you are an embarrassment." Alistair, standing beside him, simply smirked. He saw her plain dress and severe hair as the final, pathetic admission of her irrelevance. It was perfect. She would be a drab little moth, utterly eclipsed by the splendor of his evening. They turned and left for the ballroom in the West Wing, expecting her to either follow meekly in their wake, or preferably not to appear at all. Lucy paused at the bottom of the stairs, took a deep, steadying breath, and picked up the plain, leather-bound ledger she had left on the hall table. Then she began to walk. The ballroom was a symphony of light and sound, a swirling sea of silk, jewels, and self-congratulation. Julian and Alistair stood near the orchestra, accepting compliments on the estate's prosperity. Alistair was telling an animated story, his audience laughing on cue. It was at the height of this glittering performance that the music faltered. A hush began at the great arched doorway, spreading through the room like a wave, extinguishing conversation as it went. Lucy stood there, a stark figure in gray against the gilded backdrop. As she began her long walk across the polished floor, the crowd parted before her. She was the embodiment of a purpose so absolute it commanded its own gravity. Julian moved to intercept her, his face a thunderous mask of fury. "Lucy, this is not the time or place," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. "You are making a spectacle." She walked past him as if he were a statue, her eyes fixed on his brother. She stopped directly in front of Alistair, whose charming smile had frozen on his face. She held up her secret ledger. "Lord Alistair," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was so clear and cold that it carried to every corner of the silent room. "You have spoken at length this evening of the estate's newfound prosperity. I have brought the accounts, so that you might show us all precisely where it has come from." Alistair paled. He attempted a shaky laugh. "My dear Duchess, must we have a lesson in arithmetic in the middle of a ball?" The attempt at wit fell flat in the tomb-like silence. Lucy did not smile. She opened the book. "An entry dated April the 10th of this year," she read. "To Mr. Harris, for the complete re-roofing of Home Farm, £100. She lifted her gaze from the page and looked toward the edge of the crowd, where a group of tenants stood respectfully. "Mr. Harris, you are here this evening. Will you tell the company, did you re-roof Home Farm in April?" The old farmer she had met with stepped forward, his face grim. "No, Your Grace," he said, his voice ringing with truth. "The roof is as it has been for 20 years, and leaks with every rain." A collective gasp went through the room. Lucy turned a page. "To the London architectural firm of Bixby and Sons, for the design of a new West Wing, £500. She continued, her voice a relentless, quiet drumbeat of exposure. "To a Parisian vintner, for the restocking of the cellars, £300. With each entry, she dismantled Alistair's world. Mr. Finch, the land agent, who had been standing near the punch bowl, began to edge toward the door, but found his way blocked by Mr. Harris and two other broad-shouldered farmers. Julian was stammering, his face ashen, looking from his brother to his wife in horror. "Alistair, what is this? Explain this." Alistair, his charm stripped away to reveal the snarling rot beneath, turned on Lucy. "You meddling provincial shrew," he spat, his voice cracking with venom. "You were nothing, a country nobody before he raised you up." Lucy finally turned her gaze from the ledger. She looked not at Alistair, but directly at her husband. Her eyes were not filled with triumph or anger, but with a vast, devastating sorrow and a profound, unshakable clarity. She delivered her final, quiet line. "The misunderstanding is yours, Julian. You thought my competence was a hobby. It was my dowry." The sentence landed with the force of a physical blow. It reframed everything, not just the crime, but the years of casual dismissal that had allowed it to flourish. It was an indictment of his judgment, his vanity, and his failure to see the value of the woman standing before him. In the stunning silence that followed, she closed her ledger. She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the wreckage of her husband's reputation behind her. She did not look back. She did not need to. The ball did not so much end as shatter. In the wake of Lucy's departure, chaos erupted. Magistrate Abernathy, who had witnessed the entire scene with grim fascination, immediately took charge. Lord Alistair, sputtering denials that convinced no one, was quietly escorted to the library to await the arrival of the local constabulary. Mr. Finch, cornered and terrified, began to confess everything in a torrent of panicked whispers. Julian, the Duke of Stanhope, was left standing alone in the center of his opulent ballroom, a hollow man in a hollow spectacle, his guests melting away into the night, eager to carry the tale of his ruin to every drawing room in London. His reputation, so carefully cultivated, had been destroyed in less than 10 minutes. The consequences unfolded with swift and brutal logic. To avoid a public scandal that would tarnish the ducal name forever, Alistair was not imprisoned. Instead, he was stripped of his prospects and exiled to a dreary corner of the continent, with an allowance barely sufficient for survival. The truth, however, was the county's most delicious piece of gossip, and the Stanhope name was irrevocably stained. Invitations to the great houses of the neighborhood ceased. Old friends suddenly became unavailable when Julian called. Creditors, who had once been happy to extend him credit based on his title, now began to call in their loans with nervous persistence. The Folly on the Hill would never be built. Julian was forced to confront the true, ruinous state of his finances and the deeper, more painful truth of his own catastrophic failure of character. He had been so easily flattered, so quick to discard the genuine treasure he possessed in favor of the fool's gold his brother offered. He was a ghost in his own home, rattling through the grand, empty rooms, haunted by the quiet voice that had condemned him. Lucy did not leave. She did not take the title of Dowager Duchess and retreat to a quiet life elsewhere. She stayed. In the vacuum of power, she simply began her work again. She established herself not in the Duchess's lavish apartments, but in the modest estate office from which she had been banished. With the help of a grateful Mr. Harris and a new, honest land agent, she began the painstaking process of restoring the estate. She met with every tenant, renegotiated rents, and scheduled the repairs that had been falsified in Alistair's ledgers for years. She sold off the French brandy and the new porcelain. She used the funds to reopen the village school, which Alistair had closed for lack of funds. She became the de facto ruler of Stanhope Park, her authority absolute, earned not by the title she held, but by the competence she demonstrated daily. She and Julian lived in the same house, but in separate worlds, occupying opposite wings, passing like strangers in the long corridors. A year passed. It was a fine spring morning, and Lucy was in the walled garden, which was now thriving under her care. She was showing Arthur, now a sturdy boy of 3, how to pat the soil around the base of a newly planted apple tree. The air was sweet with the scent of blossoms and damp earth. She looked up and saw Julian standing at the edge of the garden, by the old stone gate. He did not enter. He was thinner. His clothes were not those of a fashionable duke, but of a simple country gentleman. The arrogance was gone from his posture, replaced by a deep, weary humility. He had been working alongside the tenants in the fields, learning the rhythms of the land he had owned but never understood. "Lucy," he said, his voice quiet, hesitant. "The estate is solvent again. The ledgers are balanced. All thanks to you." He looked at his son, then back at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, uncertain hope. "I was wondering, if you would permit me, I would like to learn how to manage things properly. I would like to help." He was asking for more than a role. He was asking for a path back. Lucy looked at him, her expression calm and unreadable. She then looked down at the small, sturdy apple tree her son was tending with such care. She did not answer his question directly. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, a simple statement of fact that carried the weight of all that had passed between them. "For titles may open the gates to an estate, Julian," she said, "but only trust can let you back into the house." He was outside the walls of her life now, and he would have to find his own way back in, if such a path even existed. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet vindication. Did the Duke deserve a second chance to earn back his wife's trust? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from today. We'll be back next week with another story. Remember, pride may wear a coronet, but character is the only true crown.